Welcome back to The Great Adventure, Pediatric Pulmonary Physiology. This is session number 11, Pulmonary Function Testing number 3, Maximal Expiratory Flow Rates. So this is The Great Adventure, Pediatric Pulmonary Physiology, and this is, you can see we're moving along down here on Pulmonary Function Testing, Maximal Expiratory Flow Rates. Again, we want to approach this with the enthusiasm of a kid in a candy shop. And recall that we've been talking about pulmonary function testing. There are basically two pulmonary function abnormality patterns: restrictive lung disease, which are stiff lungs, difficult to inflate, decreased lung volumes. We talked about that last time. And obstructive lung disease, which is airway obstruction, and we're going to talk about that today. So we're going to be talking about spirometry, the maximal expiratory flow volume curve, and correcting expiratory flow rates for lung volumes, which I think is an important point. So spirometry. So basically when we deal with obstructive lung disease, this is increased airway resistance. So it's airway obstruction, they're narrow airways, they're decreased maximal expiratory flows primarily, and increased work of breathing. So for intrapulmonary airway obstruction, which is what we're dealing with now, when you take in a breath, all right, your elastic tissue around the lung pulls on airways to open them. So airways are larger during inspiration. During exhalation, there is positive pressure around the airways, which tend to compress airways if the pressure inside the airways is less than the pressure outside. So that intrapulmonary obstruction is primarily an expiratory problem. Maximal expiratory flow rates are decreased more than inspiratory flow rates. And this is because, or again, during inspiration, full inspiration, you have elastic recoil, which is pulling on the sides of all pulmonary structures, alveoli, airways, blood vessel, lymphatics. But with respect to airways, they are larger in caliber. When you decrease lung volume, the stretch on elastic tissue becomes less, and the caliber of airways becomes smaller. So again, primarily an expiratory phenomenon. This is shown here graphically. So during inhalation, if you have some obstruction here, air can get by relatively easily, but when you exhale, the airway is smaller, and there's less room for airflow to occur. So that, again, this is primarily an expiratory phenomenon. Of course, obstruction can be more severe so that you have the ability to inhale but not to exhale. So when the airway gets closed, gets smaller, it completely closes off during exhalation so that you get hyperinflation, areas of lung that fill up but cannot empty. This leads to the following with respect to lung volumes. So if this is the normal situation, in obstructive lung diseases, sometimes the total lung capacity can actually be enlarged, but it's because the residual volume is large due to hyperinflation, and the vital capacity can actually be reduced. We talked about this before. Spirometer classically is a device where you exhale into it, you push a bell up, and this causes a pen to drop downward, so exhalation is downward on this. When you inspire, you basically suck, if you will, the bell downward, and so the pen goes upward. These classically are water-filled to basically trap the gas that's in here. And this gives you a spirogram, so if this is somebody breathing normally, they take a deep breath in all the way, blow it out hard and fast as far as they can, and then resume normal breathing again. So that you can get by direct measure from a spirometer. Now there are 4 phases of the forced vital capacity maneuver in terms of making this a valid test. So it's first a maximal inspiration of total lung capacity. Second, a blast of exhalation. Third, continued complete exhalation for up to 15 seconds. And finally, inspiration at maximal inspiratory flow back to the maximal lung volume or total lung capacity. So, before the maneuver, the pulmonary function tech inserts the mouthpiece, instructs the subject to breathe normally or easily, checks for proper posture, puts the nose clip in place, and then checks that the lips are sealed around the mouthpiece. For the maximal inspiration, note that this is unnatural and it may be uncomfortable. The inspiration should be rapid and pause at total lung capacity for less than 2 seconds. The command inspire as deeply as possible with continued prompts like more, keep going, etc. And signs of maximal inspiration, sometimes the eyebrows are raised, there's eye widening, and the subject looks uncomfortable. This is not a natural sort of thing that most people do most of the time. So it should look like this is a little bit of a unique experience. The maximal expiration, the American Thoracic Society recommends the command of blast, not just blow. So you want to encourage a full exhalation with continued prompting throughout. Keep going, etc. Continue exhaling until a plateau on the time volume curve is achieved, or a 15-second forced expiratory time, exhalation time is achieved. This is uncommon in children that this would happen. But the plateau, yes. When the subject views a display showing that he or she is still exhaling, this helps to achieve better results. So there are a number for children, birthday candles, a number of things like that. Timing of the beginning of a maximal exhalation. So there is a thing called a back extrapolation volume. So, for example, in this setting, this would be kind of ideal. So basically somebody inspires, in this case down, and exhales completely. What you can see here is that this person didn't quite get that exhalation immediately. So what is recommended is that one back extrapolate by taking the slope of the line nearest the beginning. All right, and you'll find that there's a little bit of a difference here between where the patient actually started and here. This is the point that should be used for timing. All right, so this corrects for a slow initiation of exhalation, and the basically this back extrapolation volume should be less than 5% of the forced vital capacity. This one isn't too bad. This would be an example of a poor beginning, and you can see again this volume is fairly high compared to this one, but this would be the timing point that would be used to calculate, for example, FEV1. Into forced exhalation. So the time volume plateau, all right, in the last second there should be less than a 25 ml per second change, right? 0.025 liters is 25 mLs. A forced exhalation time of 15 seconds, longer rarely changes clinically relevant values. But let me just say in children it would be unusual for a child to be able to exhale for 15 seconds. It's not, however, necessary. If the subject cannot achieve a plateau, we try for multiple forced vital capacities, which are reproducible. So this would be premature termination of the FVC maneuver, and you can see that if this is the normal situation, this person just dropped off here, and you get this sort of picture. Again, here's one where you can see this person just dropped off, didn't really perform the maneuver correctly. But now what is being used as an indication of a good effort is not so much forced expiratory time, but the evenness of this plateau. So the plateau over the last second should have less than a 25 ml change from beginning or end to that second. So forced expiratory time is no longer a requirement for an acceptable forced vital capacity maneuver. More than 95% of subjects who exhaled for greater than 6 seconds achieved an acceptable plateau, but only 18% of healthy children aged 10 to 18 were able to meet the forced expiratory time criteria. And even though they did not meet that, or some didn't, most did not meet that, they were able to achieve a acceptable plateau based on the 25 ml change in the last second. Maximal inhalation and total lung capacity. So the subject remains on the mouthpiece, and the pulmonary function coaches to rapidly inspire to full inflation. This needs to be coached with equal vigor as the initial maximal exhalation, and frankly, in our experience, this is hard for many children to do. This forced inspiratory vital capacity can be compared with the forced expiratory vital capacity to help determine if the subject initially inhaled all the way to total lung capacity. This sort of instruction is probably more relevant for adults than children. We do the best we can for children. How many maneuvers? Generally, you perform at least 3. The forced vital capacities ideally should agree within 0.15 liters or 150 mLs for subject over 6 and 100 mLs for subject less than 6. FEV1 should agree within, again, 0.15 liters or 150 mLs for patients over 6 and less than 100 mLs for subjects less than 6. If criteria are not met, you may do up to 8 additional trials, but more than 8 rarely give you any better results. In terms of reporting, the largest forced vital capacity is reported. So pulmonary function testing is a best effort activity. You don't want to know the average, you want to know the best. So the largest FVC is reported. The largest FEV1 is reported, even if it doesn't come from the same curve as the largest FVC. And then the FEV1 over FVC ratio is calculated from the largest value, even if they did not come from the same maneuver. The FEF 2575 is reported from the maneuver with the largest FVC plus FEV1. So this is an example of a normal spirogram. Person is breathing normally, inhales to maximum total lung capacity, exhales forcibly down to residual volume, and that's maintained down there for at least a second or so. Obstructive lung disease means that the patient cannot exhale as fast. So the dotted lines are the normal predicted value. So this person can't exhale quite as fast, and consequently the slope of this line or the whole curve is prolonged. There are 2 things that are generally quantitated. The FEV1 or forced expiratory volume in 1 second. Now note that this is actually a volume. And so if the person started to exhale here, it's how much he or she got out in that first second. Okay, and that would be the length of this blue line. Somebody with obstructive disease, you could see they can't get air out as fast, so they don't get as much out in the first second, and their FEV1 would be only the length of this red line. The other is called the FEF 2575 forced expiratory flow between 25% and 75% of the forced vital capacity, or the middle half of this curve. So basically it's going to be the flow rate, the slope of this line, over the middle half of this curve. So this person exhaled 25%, you measure this to 75%, and then that's the slope you take. This person with obstruction, you can see the slope of that line is shallower and the value is less. Now this is important because it's linked to USC football. So several years ago, when I was in my USC season tickets seats for the USC football, beginning of the season, an elderly gentleman sat down next to me, and so in those days there was a USC faculty staff section. So I introduced myself and I said, "So why are you in the faculty staff section?" He said, "Well, I'm a pulmonologist, but now I'm retired." I go, "Ooh, well, I'm a pediatric pulmonologist," so I get very excited. So it turned out this gentleman was Edmund Llewellyn. Edmund Llewellyn was the person who first described what was originally called the maximum mid-expiratory flow rate, or MMEF, and now we call it the FEF 2575. So why did he do this? We have FEV1. Why did he feel it was important to come up with a new measure for maximal expiratory flows? So think like a pulmonary function technician for a moment. What are the 2 most variable parts of this maneuver? It's going to be the beginning and the end. So what Edmund Llewellyn said was, let's just eliminate these 2. Let's just look at flow in the middle, which should be determined primarily by physiology and not so much by effort. So that's the beauty or value, if you will, of the FEF 2575 is basically the fact that it measures the middle half of this curve. So if we look at other pulmonary function abnormality patterns, restrictive lung disease might look like this. So you can see it doesn't get up to total lung capacity, but the flow rates are quite adequate here, okay, essentially normal. This would be mild obstructive disease. We talked about that. This would be more severe obstructive disease, and also note that there's hyperinflation here. This person can't exhale to the normal predicted residual volume. This would be very severe obstructive disease, like you might see in an adult with emphysema. Note that the total lung capacity can actually be increased, and the residual volume is hugely increased, and flow rate here is very flat, very decreased. So normal spirometry values are based on percent predicted. These are the values that we use or have used at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. FEV1 normal range here, FEV over FVC ratio greater than 80. FEF 2575 is a bit broader range. It's less reproducible, so about 68 to 132% predicted. And peak flow, FEF max, forced expiratory flow max, is also less predictable, 74 to 126% predicted. This is the current PFT reporting format that we use here at Children's. So for spirometry, there's the reference value, which is the predicted. There's the measured value for the patient, and pre here means pre-bronchodilator. Basically, this is divided by this to give us a percent predicted value. And then based on GLI values, there's an upper limit and lower limit normal and upper limit of normal as well, which actually should be used instead of the numbers that I showed you earlier. So in terms of quantitating airway obstruction, there are basically two published criteria. The American Thoracic Society, as you can see, normal for FEV1 is greater than 80%, mild 70 to 79, moderate 60 to 69, moderately severe 50 to 59, severe 35 to 49, and very severe less than 35. The CF Foundation, a little simpler. Normal is greater than 80, mild is 70 to 90, moderate is 40 to 69, and severe is less than 40. So slow versus fast vital capacity or forced vital capacity. So the forced vital capacity can be less than the slow vital capacity due to dynamic hyperinflation. And this is seen in obstructive lung disease. So what's plotted here is basically the inspiratory capacity. So there's tidal volume and inspiratory reserve volume, okay? And you can see that in this particular individual with dynamic hyperinflation, when this person exercises, i.e. breathes faster, all right, the inspiratory capacity is less, meaning that there's more hyperinflation, more residual volume here, or more FRC actually. And then maximal exercise, there's a significantly decreased inspiratory capacity. So during quiet breathing, there's relatively less positive interpleural pressure during exhalation, so there's less airway closure. During a maximal expiratory maneuver, there's greater positive interpleural pressure during exhalation, so there's more airway closure. In airway obstruction, greater airway closure in a maximal expiratory flow volume maneuver causes a decreased forced vital capacity compared to slow vital capacity. So this is always something worth looking at, is the difference between these two maneuvers. All right, let's look at the maximal expiratory flow volume curve. So again, airway obstruction intrapulmonary is a expiratory phenomenon. And remember again that airways are decreasing in caliber as you decrease lung volume. So if you recall, airways are basically categorized according to generation. So the tracheal, largest airway in the body, is generation 0. Main stem bronchi are generation 1. Each division is a generation, till finally out to the alveolar duct, which is in most textbooks generation number 23. So, airway velocity and airway size. So, the trachea is the largest airway in the body, all right? And as you go down toward peripheral airways, the caliber of each airway decreases. But the total cross-sectional area of all airways in that generation is the opposite. Trachea is the largest airway in the body, but there's only one of them. Mainstem bronchi reach a bit less than the trachea, but they're two, and the total cross-sectional area is greater. And finally, you get out to peripheral airways, which are very small indeed, but there are 500 million of them. So the total cross-sectional area is huge. And in fact, we get this plot with essentially exponentially increasing total cross-sectional area as you go from generation 0 to generation 23. Now, flow is the amount of gas movement, liters per second. Velocity is the speed of gas movement, centimeters per second. So flow is going to equal velocity, the speed of each molecule, times the cross-sectional area, that is all of the molecules that are moving. So if we look at this with airways, it's kind of like a river. And let's just think about a river for a moment with no tributaries in or out. So I'm standing up here at the top of this waterfall. All of the water from the river has to go through this narrow cross-sectional area. So the velocity of each water molecule is huge. All right. And in fact, if I stand up here and throw a leaf on that water, it's gone. All right. It moved very, very rapidly. Now let's say that this same river, I go down 5-10 miles, and it opens up into a huge bog, a mile across. Huge total cross-sectional area. But the same amount of water is passing my point if I'm standing at the edge of the bog or standing at the edge of a waterfall. So because total cross-sectional area is so huge, if I throw a leaf on that, it's just kind of gradually moving along. Total amount of water crossing me is the same, but because the total cross-sectional area is so huge, the velocity is small. The same is true in the lungs. The large airways, i.e. the trachea, act like the waterfall. The total cross-sectional area is small. So to get all the air out, the velocity through those large airways has to be very, very high. If we go down to small airways, the total cross-sectional area is huge. So the velocity does not have to be large in order for the same amount of gas to move. And so you see this gradual decrease here from large airways into middle airways into small airways. Okay? And what this curve represents is the maximal expiratory flow that can occur at any lung volume. Now, this is often referred to as the effort-independent portion of the curve. What does that mean? That means that I have to generate effort to get to this point, but if I generate more effort, I don't get any more flow for it. So this flow here is actually determined, as we learned when we talked about mechanics, by mechanical properties of the lung, compliance and resistance, determine this flow rate. So this actually is a curve determined by physiologic properties of the lung. So again, the effort-independent portion describes maximal expiratory flow at each lung volume. The isovolume pressure flow curve, which we talked about when we talked about mechanics, proves that maximal expiratory flow is achieved and the flow cannot be exceeded with increased effort. Right? You have to put enough effort in to get to that point, but flow can't be exceeded if you put in increased effort. Now, the slope of this line, okay, is liters per minute divided by liters. So if you look at that, that's 1 over seconds. It's actually 1 over the time constant. So the time constant is resistance times compliance. So the slope of this line is actually 1 over the time constant, or 1 over resistance times compliance in the lung. So the effort-independent portion, the slope is 1 over time constant, okay? And if we have a curve, different curves here, you can see that this would represent a much longer time constant. It takes longer to fill the lungs than this curve. Similarly, we can have a curve with what looks like 2 parts, and the time constant here would be smaller than the time constant here. And similarly, we can go to 3 parts, And the same sort of thing. Time constant here is much longer than the time constant up here. But the 1 over the time constant is what defines that slope of the effort independent portion of the maximal expiratory flow volume curve. Okay. So basically then this curve reflects large airways at the top, middle-sized airways in the middle, and small airways down here. All right. There are a number of things that are sometimes measured on the flow volume curve. So one is called the forced expiratory flows after exhaling 25%, 50%, and 75%. These are often reported on pulmonary function tests. They're instantaneous flows at these points. They do have a lot of variation, and consequently, a lot of people don't use them, but that's what they refer to. So FEF 25 is after you've exhaled 25%, after you've exhaled 50%, after you've exhaled 75%. The FEF 25-75 is the flow between having exhaled 25% until exhaling 75% of the vital capacity, and it would be the mean slope in this area. Now, as we talked about, most airway resistance is large airway or central airway resistance. And remember, 80% of airway resistance occurs in central airways, all right? If we had an airway disease where we increased central airway resistance, i.e. asthma occurs in large airways because that's where bronchial smooth muscle is, right? If we double central airway resistance, we're going to significantly increase airway resistance, and these people are going to know it. People with asthma know when they have an asthma attack. It's not subtle. On the other hand, if you had a disease characterized by only peripheral airway lung disease, and you double peripheral airway resistance, you don't have much effect on total airway resistance, so you may not notice it. Consequently, small airway obstruction is silent until you have advanced lung disease. So let's just look at some maximal expiratory flow volume curves. This would be a normal curve, relatively triangular. Restrictive disease would be a decreased volume. And if you plot it on an absolute scale, as shown here, it would look like this. This is mild obstructive disease. This is large airway obstruction. So remember, large airways are responsible for flow up here, and that looks like the curve, the top is chopped. Now, the question often arises, is this truly large airway obstruction or poor effort, and how can you tell? So the way we can do it is ask patients to do a cough peak flow. So if patients cough and this is what they get, this is probably real, because with coughing, which ordinarily is the highest flow rates possible, they could not exceed this curve. On the other hand, if it looks like this, then clearly they can achieve these flow rates. It's just that this was poor effort. So you don't need the whole forced vital capacity curve, just the first part. I think you can see for either of those we can answer the question if we just get the cough flows in this range. Middle and small airway obstruction, so it deviates from the predicted in the middle and small airway region. This would be isolated small airway obstruction. We actually don't see this very often, but theoretically that's what it would look like. Severe airway obstruction across the board is way down compared to normal predicted. And this would be severe airway obstruction with hyperinflation. Note the residual volume is markedly increased. And really, the predicted flows really extend up here. So this is a huge decrease in expiratory flow. Now, FEV1, okay, is oftentimes the standard that many societies use to determine severity of lung disease. However, you should know that it changes with the severity of obstruction. It is a bit of a moving target. So we can actually plot the FEV1 on the flow volume curve. So we know an FEV1 ratio, FEV1 over FVC ratio of 90% in a normal individual means that 90% of this curve is included in the FEV1. So this is going to reflect large, middle, and small airway obstruction. Now let's assume that we have moderate airway obstruction. The FEV1 over FVC is 60% of predicted. So now this flow volume curve, 60% of that curve is reflected here, and you can see that it's reflecting primarily large and middle-sized airways. And if we have severe obstruction, as shown here, with an FEV1 over FVC ratio of 30%, only 30% of this curve is incorporated, so this is only large airway obstruction. So the key here is that depending on the degree or the severity of airway obstruction, the FEV1 reflects anywhere from large, middle, and small to only large airways. In contradistinction, the FEF 2575 always reflects the middle half of the curve. Okay, always reflects the middle half of the curve, no matter what the degree of obstruction. Okay, so you will often see in someone with obstructive disease that they may have an FEV1 of, let's say, 60% predicted. The FEF 2575 might be 45% predicted. All right. The reason, at least in part, is that as you get more airway obstruction, the FEV1 reflects mostly large airways, whereas the FEF 2575 always reflects the middle-sized airways, or the middle part of that curve. Maximal expiratory flow transients. So note this little blip here. This is due to bronchiectasis of large airways. And initially highly compliant bronchiectatic airways collapse suddenly, causing transient high flow, and this is followed by severe obstruction in remaining airways. So it's kind of a two-compartment model here, where the red reflects this highly compliant flow transient, and the blue reflects really the flow volume curve of the severe airway obstruction. So these are just a couple of real-life examples. So this is a nice example here. There's a flow transient, but then this quickly falls to very low flow rates here. Here's another one. Again, a nice flow transient, which is that rapid collapse of saccular bronchiectasis, for example. And then that's followed by severe obstruction. So, you know, when many of us were kids, we would blow up a paper bag and pop them. All right, we're not popping bronchiectasis, but it's the same thing. All of a sudden, you're taking a deep breath, then you generate a positive intrathoracic pressure, and you collapse these saccular bronchiectatic sections, and then what you're left with is the very severe obstruction in the remainder of the airways. So that gives you what's called a maximal expiratory flow transient. And the way I describe this in pulmonary function testing is I say there is an initial maximal expiratory flow transient due to rapid collapse of highly compliant bronchiectatic airways, followed by severe airway obstruction in the middle and small airways. So that's how I would describe this in a pulmonary function report. So how does poor effort affect the FEV1? Well, exhalation less than 1 second will decrease the FEV1. Poor effort often starts with poor initiation, which will also decrease the FEV1. But exhalation of at least 1 second may give a normal FEV1, but a decreased FVC and an increased FEV1 over FVC ratio. How does poor effort affect the FEF 2575? So pulmonary function tests take the best effort. A poor exhalation may decrease the FEF 2575, but premature termination of exhalation will increase the FEF 2575. So how does that work? So if this is the normal curve for an individual, and now he does a premature termination, now you're taking the middle half of a higher portion of this curve, and the value will actually be increased. So poor effort can increase the FEF 2575. Sensitivity of PFTs. So these are some studies of children with cystic fibrosis who had relatively mild disease. And you can see arterial oxygen tension was the most sensitive. Residual volume, we've talked about this, is a very sensitive index. If you have 25/7 FEV1 and vital capacity in decreasing order. This is a different study of children with mild CF. And again, in this case, residual volume, very sensitive. FF 25/75, airway resistance, FEV1, vital capacity, normal in that order. These are asthmatic children, not during an attack. And again, RV is abnormal, FEF 2575, airway resistance, FEV1, and vital capacity are abnormal in declining area. These are PFTs in asymptomatic asthmatic patients with normal FEV1, FEV1 over FVC, and FEF 2575. And you can see that the the RV-TLC is still abnormal, and RV is still abnormal in this group. So, finally, correcting expiratory flow rates for lung volumes. So, when you see a flow volume curve on a pulmonary function test, in virtually all situations, they line it up at total lung capacity. That is, they start the curve here. They show you this as your predicted values. So, what is this curve? Is this airway obstruction or is this restriction? All right. Now, as I said, the machine generally lines up the maximum expiratory flow volume curve at the total lung capacity. So, can we tell if this is obstruction or restriction? So, if plotted on an absolute lung volume, so we now have 0 to residual volume to TLC, this is obstruction because the flow rates are decreased compared to the predicted value, and the total lung capacity is normal. But if this one is plotted on an absolute lung volume, this is restriction. Here you can see that the flow rates for the lung volumes at which you're measured are normal. Admittedly, the volumes are decreased, but at the volumes at which the flows are measured, they are normal. So what is this? Looks normal. If plotted on absolute lung volume, this is normal. But it could be this on an absolute lung volume, which would be obstruction with hyperinflation, because flow rates are decreased, the predicted, even though the curve looks fairly triangular. So one can plot flow rates on an absolute lung volume axis, and the way to do this easily is to take a plot of predicted total lung capacity, a predicted residual volume, and predicted peak flow. That's going to give you this triangle of the normal flow volume curve. And then you take the patient's actual TLC, actual peak flow, and actual residual volume and plot them in there. Okay? So this patient has airway obstruction in addition to restriction. See, these flows are decreased, and of course the lung volumes are decreased as well. All right. So children have very different sized lungs depending on age, growth, and medical conditions. Maximal expiratory flow rates and airway resistance are best predicted by lung volume. You cannot understand maximal expiratory flow rates without knowing the lung volumes at which they are measured. So what is the best way to correct pulmonary function testing for different sized lungs? So Zapletal and Motoyama did a study, and they showed that maximal expiratory flow rates are best corrected by total lung capacity. Further, they said one can express maximum expiratory flow rates as the flow at 60, 70, and 80% of total lung capacity, measured from 0 volume. And then to correct for lung volume, they are expressed as TLCs per second. So if I had a total lung capacity of 5 liters, okay, and I had a flow rate at 80% total lung capacity of 7.5 liters per second, okay, that's 7.5 divided by 5, or 1.5 TLCs per second. All right, so this would be kind of what this looks like. And the beauty of this is that this does completely correct for different sized lungs. So the normal values here are actually numbers. It's not a regression. So this is true of everybody, that the normal predicted Vmax 80, for example, is 1.29 TLCs per second. Fairly large standard deviation, unfortunately, so abnormal would be less than these values. Okay, units are TLCs per second. And this is the way they show up on our pulmonary function test report at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. So we have the Vmaxes 60, 70, and 80, normal predicted values in TLCs per second, what the person actually measured, upper and lower limit of normal, and then percent predicted. Okay, just like with everything else. The difference here is this is just a number that's true for everybody. And these upper and lower limits of normal are true for everybody as well. How can Vmax flow rates help us to better understand airway obstruction? Children with hyperinflation may have normal flow rates, but are flow rates normal at increased lung volume? Children with restrictive disease will have decreased flow rates, but are they decreased in excess of the reduced lung volumes? So, if this is a normal situation, if somebody is hyperinflated, these Vmaxes are going to be decreased because partly because they're divided by a larger total lung capacity. For restrictive disease, this might be the normal situation here. These have normal Vmaxes, right? But if they have airway obstruction in addition, right, then these values are going to be decreased. So patients with restrictive lung disease will have decreased expiratory flow rate because there's decreased volume. FEV1 or FVC ratio is normal in restriction alone, decreased if there's also airway obstruction. Flow rates are decreased in proportion to the reduction in lung volume in restriction and a greater decrease with obstruction. And so therefore Vmaxes that are decreased from normal indicate obstruction in addition to restriction. So the Vmax 60, it turns out, is a sensitive pulmonary function test to detect lung disease. Expiratory flow rates correlate best with lung volume. The Vmax 60 does correct for lung volume. So if expiratory flow rates are technically normal, but the child is hyperinflated, the Vmax will be decreased. Flow rates are not normal at the lung volume where they were measured. All right. And this just shows an example, again, of a study of CF patients with mild disease. Vmax 60 was in fact the most sensitive test to detect abnormalities in this group. Sequelae of lung disease, we know that the same etiology can present as different lung diseases based on the stage of lung development. Classic example again being respiratory syncytial virus, which causes a mild upper respiratory infection in adults, but potentially life-threatening bronchiolitis in infants. Early lung disease may also alter subsequent lung development, leading to long-term sequelae. So David Botter, former fellow here at Children's Hospital Los Angeles, 1985 to 87, studied 10 children, age 10, who had BPD versus 8 controls. Ages were not different. Obviously, gestational age, birth weight, days on ventilator, and days of oxygen by design were different than controls. And you can see total lung capacity did not change. Vital capacity was lower and residual volume higher. We showed this before. That's a sensitive index. But also RVTLC and the flow rates, FEV1, FEF 2575, significantly different in this group of kids who were, I should say, asymptomatic. These were not kids being followed in pulmonary clinic, but these were kids who had BPD but were not, to the best of their knowledge, having any problems. The Vmax 60s now, across the board, 80, 70, and 60, all significantly decreased. And the beauty here is that this reflects flow corrected for the lung volumes at which they're measured. Soumya Swaminathan was a pulmonary fellow here, 1987-89. She looked at 11 children, age 8, who had meconium aspiration syndrome as neonates, compared them to 9 controls. They actually had similar gestational age and birth weights. And in her case, total lung capacity, vital capacity, not different. Residual volume was increased. In her case, the flow rates were not significantly different, but the Vmaxes were. Vmax 80, 70, and 60 were all less in those children who had meconium aspiration syndrome. Closing volume, slope of phase 3, we'll talk about another time, were, at least closing volume was different. Slope of phase 3 was not. So, what have we learned? There are basically two pulmonary function abnormality patterns, restrictive disease and obstructive lung disease. Spirometry can measure instory reserve volume, tidal volume, expiratory reserve volume, vital capacity, and instory capacity. Spirometry is a time volume curve which measures maximal expiratory flow rates. FEV1 measures predominantly large airway obstruction with worse obstruction, and FEF2575 measures middle-sized airway obstruction. Maximal expiratory flow rates are highest in large airways and lowest in small airways. The maximal expiratory flow volume curve shows which size airways are obstructed, large, middle, or small. Lung volume is the best way to correct for maximal expiratory flow rates, and maximal expiratory flow rates are best interpreted in relation to the lung volume at which they were measured. So next time, we're going to explore a little bit more about airway obstruction, specifically bronchial hyperactivity, and also distribution of ventilation. So our thanks again to our producer-director, Katie LeWinter, and thank you for joining me for this, The Great Adventure, Pediatric Pulmonary Physiology.